Hello and welcome to Class 6 of Herbology 101. Our class today is on Calendula and Plantain, and we are going to be learning how to make salves. Before we get started, as usual, we are going to do a little bit of review. So our first review question is, which 3 ingredients can you use to create a syrup? So you are going to choose 3 of these answers. The first one is A, aspartame, B, honey, C, glycerin, or D, decoctions. If you answered B, C, and D, honey, glycerin, and decoctions, you are correct. Let's look at our next question. Our next question is, the idea that animals know and seek out plants in nature to cure their illnesses is called A, zoology, B, zoopharmacognosy, C, materia medica, or D, zoo meds. If you chose B, zoopharmacognosy, you are correct. Now let's go to our last review question of the day. Our last review question is, what is a rubefacient? Does a rubefacient A, provide nourishment or nutrition, B, cause body tissues to contract, C, stop bleeding and cause coagulation or clotting, or D, increase blood flow to the surface skin? If you answered D, increase blood flow to the surface skin, then you are correct. So that concludes our little bit of review for the day. Let's go ahead and talk about properties today. We only have 2 properties today. The first one is a vulnerary. A vulnerary is something that encourages the healing of wounds. The second one is a deobstruent. A deobstruent can clear the obstructions in the ducts of the body. Think about the bile duct or things within the kidneys or liver. Can clear those parts of the body out. So now that we have our 2 properties for the week, let's go ahead and let's talk about our herbs. The first herb that we're going to talk about this week is plantain. And as far as smell and taste, plantain isn't a particularly strong smelling or tasting plant. In fact, it tastes kind of like spinach or maybe kale. It's often used as a pot herb to make greens that you can eat with a meal, or sometimes it's even used in salads. As far as the look and feel, the leaves in this particular picture are of broadleaf plantain. So they have a broad leaf, kind of a rounded and broad shape. And as far as feel, they're not particularly remarkable. They're kind of smooth and veined on the leaves, and they grow a spike that has a little bit of texture to it, but not too much. Now let's talk about a little bit more about broadleaf plantain. So broadleaf plantain is what is known as Plantago major. There is another type of plantain called Plantago lanceolata. And if you know anything, if you look at the root of that word, you'll see lance or maybe even Lancelot, like the knight Lancelot from King Arthur. And when we think of lance, or even Lancelot carrying a lance or a sword, we think of something that's kind of tall and slender, and that is what narrowleaf plantain looks like. It looks tall and slender like a lance or a sword. They pretty much have the same properties. So they're relatively interchangeable. But let's talk about broadleaf plantain today, and let's talk about its properties. So its properties include, it is a vulnerary, it is a deobstruent, it is a refrigerant, it's a diuretic, it's an astringent, it's an anti-inflammatory, it's a hemostatic. It has all sorts of properties. It has lots and lots of different properties. It's a big, big helper. We commonly use it as a salve, as a poultice, or as an oil to treat stings or bites or wounds. And it can be used internally for urinary tract infections. Now, when we talk about it being used as a poultice, sometimes you might hear of people actually taking the plant out of their yard. Perhaps they got a bug bite while they were standing out in the yard. They take the plant, they put it in their mouth, they chew it up, and they put that chewed up plant material as a poultice on their bug bite or sting or so on. I do not recommend this. I know people who do it and they say it's wonderful, but it's not one that I personally would recommend doing, but you might hear about it. So that's why I want to talk about it. Plantain is truly one of the most common plants in the world. You will find it pretty much everywhere you go. And in fact, this week as you travel through your week, I want you to look and see if you can find plantain in your yard, on the sidewalk, maybe as you're walking to school or something like that. Look and see if you can find a plantain plant, because I promise that if you look hard enough, you will find this plant. So that is plantain. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is calendula. Now, as far as calendula goes, the smell, it's a floral smell, not the strongest floral smell, but a good floral smell. Now, when we look at calendula, we see these flowers, and normally we don't think of eating flowers so much, do we? But calendula is an exception. It's what we call an edible flower, and it's often used to decorate things like cakes or to put in salads and different types of food applications. So it tastes, it's a slightly bitter, but a little less bitter maybe than some other herbs. As far as looks go, it ranges in color. The flowers range in color from a yellow color to a very, very deep, deep orange color, kind of like the one that you see here in the picture. As far as feel goes, it's not the most remarkable herb. Its qualities lie in the flower and in the color of that flower primarily. So now that we've got to know calendula just a little bit, let's talk more about it. So calendula is interesting in that it is also commonly known as marigold. So in the United States, we generally refer to it as calendula. If you go over to England, it's commonly referred to as marigold. Now, the interesting part about this, and this is the reason why we always want to watch our botanical name. So calendula here is called Calendula officinalis. Now, what we call marigold here in the United States is something completely different. It's a Mexican or African marigold or a French marigold in this Tagetes erecta, Tagetes petula genus. It's not the same plant at all. Mexican and African and French marigolds have their uses, usually as bug repellents and companion plants, but they're not the same as calendula. They do not have the same properties, and this is something you really need to watch. In fact, when I was growing up, one of the first herb books I ever had was a book that my mother kept around the house, and it was written by a British woman. So I didn't know that, and when I looked at the entry for marigold or calendula, I didn't know that the marigold and calendula that was being discussed in that book was not the same marigold or calendula that my mother was growing in her garden. I know that now, and luckily I didn't do anything with those marigolds that were growing in my mother's garden as a substitution for calendula. But this is a really good reason why it's very important to know your botanical names and to know the differences between your plants. So you're not using something that's has a completely different set of properties and using it for the wrong thing. So let's talk about those properties of calendula. Calendula is a vulnerary. This is probably its primary property. It's a diaphoretic, it's an alterative, and it's an astringent as well. We see it commonly used in a lot of skincare products. I believe the Burt's Bees company, in fact, has an entire line of calendula products. As far as uses go, it helps with bruises, with burns, earaches, shingles, eruptive skin conditions, acne, and things like that. We commonly use it as an oil or in a salve or in a poultice. The oil of calendula is commonly used for earaches, although I do ask you to use that with caution, because I've heard some really horrible stories from friends of mine who are osteopaths who have had to deal with people putting oils in their ears, and the results were not good. So be careful with that. I'm always a fan of putting essential oils around the outside of your ears if your ears are congested, but generally not actually in your ears. So be careful with that one. So these are, this is calendula. So that concludes our herbs for today. Let's talk a little bit about salves. So what is a salve? A salve is a preparation made from infused oil and from some type of butter or wax, typically beeswax. The most basic salve recipe is right here. You take 1 cup of infused oil to 1 ounce of beeswax, and you heat them up together and blend them together and put them into your container. I actually have a couple of different videos here for you to watch. The first one is a comfrey salve video that comes from Mountain Rose Herbs, their video collection. The second video I have is actually one that I've made myself about frankincense and myrrh salve. So I would ask that you watch both of those. What John does in the comfrey video and what I do with my frankincense and myrrh salve are slightly different. He uses a double boiler. I don't use a double boiler. I'm just very, very careful about what I put into my salves, or how I'm watching it, what I'm doing when I'm watching it on the stove. So go ahead and watch those so you can see a couple of different ways to make a salve. And when you are finished watching those, go ahead and answer our weekly questions. So our weekly questions, we have 4 this week. Number 1, what is a salve? Number 2, how do we use a salve? So we talk about salves. What are some things that we could use a salve for? Number 3, what are the 2 ways that we discuss, or what are 2 ways? We discuss more than 2 ways. What are 2 ways that we discuss to make an herb-infused oil? Because that is the basis for your salve recipe. So that's why we studied it back a few classes ago, so that you could get an idea of what that was before we got to this class on salves. So how could we make those herb-infused oils? A little refresher review for you. Now, we talk about beeswax and infused oils, but what are some other items that you could use to make a salve? There is a whole huge world of products out there that you can use to make a salve. And I want you to explore that a little bit this week as you're going through things. Next week, I'll see what you all come up with, and if I have anything to add in, I will definitely go ahead and add those as well. As always, if you have any questions this week, please feel free to let me know, and I will be more than happy to answer them. And if you have no questions, I look forward to reading your answers for this week, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.